Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for a really cool event, learning all about resumes and interviews, but also getting time to get feedback on your resumes and perhaps your interviewing skills from industry. So today we have some really great sponsors joining us, donating their time to give our students feedback. So we have Citadel, Essentia, and Atlassian joining us later. But to start off with, we thought we'd give a little bit of a presentation, a bit of a workshop on how to write a great resume, and also tips and tricks on the interviewing process. Thankfully, we've got a CSOC alum, Nathan Ellis, who has agreed to share his insights as someone who's been through that process. So without further ado, take it away, Nathan.
Cool. Welcome, everyone. As CC introduced me, my name's Nathan. I studied software engineering at UNSW, and I graduated last year, so 2020. Some of you might know me as I was heavily involved in CSCSOC as the socials director, and kind of involved for a few years. So as always, feel free to connect on LinkedIn or Facebook if you want to reach out or discuss anything that I'm presenting today. And before I start, please feel free to ask any questions throughout the workshop. I'll try my best to leave a couple of minutes at the end to answer any questions that are sent through. Today, we're going to be kind of going through a lot of resume and interview tips that will hopefully help each of you succeed in your job search. So first things first, resumes. This is kind of the first step of the interview process. The first thing that you kind of realize when you're writing a resume, it has another name, which is called a CV, and CV in Latin is curriculum vitae, which is kind of a fancy word. Basically, a resume is a document that lists your work experience, education, skills, and achievements. The actual Latin meaning is the course of life, which is actually kind of an accurate description when you're describing your professional kind of life journal. So before we get started in terms of going through a resume or actually outlining what you should include in a resume, there's 4 key things to understand. The first one is that you kind of have this important first step of the resume in terms of selling yourself. So it's extremely important to any employer because it's the first time that you're submitting something to them in order for them to understand whether you're suitable for a role and ultimately decide if they want to invite you for a job interview. So 4 basics of resumes. The first one, which some people realize, some people don't actually realize, is that the resume isn't actually going to get you a job. So the resume is only going to get you an interview, which will hopefully get you a job. And there's lots of online resources that can help you with that, which we'll go through a bit later. The second thing is to treat your resume as an opportunity to share something that makes you, shows that you are special and what makes you unique. So for example, some of the things that you share in terms of your experience or accomplishments, which are unique to you, are things that you want to present in terms of your resume as the first point of view for an employer. Also, there's the need to adjust your resume depending on the role that you're applying for. So in my experience, sometimes, for example, if I was applying for a role as a front-end engineer, that would be completely different to if I was applying for a role, for example, as a security engineer, or maybe you want to be like a product manager. And in terms of those different roles, you kind of want to demonstrate different skills. So for example, depending on the role or description, you might need to highlight different skills, and you also might need to order some of the sections a bit differently to draw on your most relevant experience. So say if I was doing a product manager role, something like leadership or ownership might be something that's more important on top of the technical skills as well. One additional thing, which is kind of strange and maybe not as relevant here, is that in Australia, we kind of use a resume and a CV interchangeably. So basically, you can either refer to it in a job description as a resume or a CV here. But in other countries, such as the US, they can actually be kind of different. And the main difference is that if you're applying for an overseas role, sometimes they'll refer to the resume as a summary, a 1 to 2 page summary, which is what we'll be talking about today. But otherwise, if they're asking you for a CV, for example, if you want to work in the US, it typically means that there's no length limit and you can pretty much outline everything that you want. But a friendly reminder, probably in the context of today, will be referring to something more local, so Australia-based, which means that your recruiter would be very sad if you wrote a full 100-page PDF of all your life experiences in a CV format. So we'll kind of use the Australian definition here and just interchangeably use resume and CV. Cool. In terms of general tips, for undergraduates, you always want to use one page. Sometimes people refer to 1 to 2 pages, but until you have, for example, more than 10 years of experience, you still want to aim for 1 page. So if you're struggling on length, try and cut down different sections, try and summarize it a bit more concisely, and focus on things that can really present in terms of a wow factor, not necessarily how you did something. So don't get bogged down with too many long descriptions of responsibilities. For example, let's say that I had worked 3 different jobs. I should still be able to fit those 3 different jobs and the key highlights of what I did in those 3 jobs inside of a resume. And ideally, it should be able to fit onto 1 page. Most importantly, this is really significant because a lot of recruiters are reading hundreds or thousands of resumes. And there's a lot of surveys which actually say that they can perhaps even skim through resumes in about 7 seconds. So if they're reading something and it's 2 pages in 7 seconds, you can imagine that they're kind of just scrolling through. And if it's not something that stands out to them, then perhaps they won't actually move through and progress you to the interview stage. Second thing is you kind of want to keep margins. So something that, for example, if people send me a resume to give feedback on, you don't want to just fill the whole page. Like you give it an A4 page, and some people, they use like no margins and they have like words starting from the top left already. It's not necessarily something you want to do. You can, for example, in say something like Word, you can use it in terms of narrow, but using no margins just makes it, fill a page. And that kind of doesn't, it kind of detracts from the meaning of the resume. And there's also a reason why, for example, books don't do that and they don't just fill the page and they actually keep margins as well. Same thing with fonts. It's really simple, but it's something that's seen a lot. You kind of want to make sure that you're at least giving it a reasonable font size, say more than 10. And also that you're using an easy font family font to use. So don't use something like Comic Sans, and you perhaps want to use something like Arial or Times New Roman, or even use a resume template, which you can find online as well. Another thing is to use white space to your advantage. So you want to keep a simple balance between text and white space. Basically, if you're describing things in different sections, still use white space and don't just fill it up so that you can fill the page with more information. Sometimes having more white space in between those sections can be useful in terms of someone skimming through, because they can clearly understand what's in each section as well.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, with the 1-page rule, is that front and back, or is it just printed on one side?
I would say that that's just front. And the main reason for that is that 99% of companies will only read it in terms of a PDF. So there's not really a back and front page on a PDF. It will just be split into 2. So it's much easier if they're skimming through in terms of having 1 page. Sometimes they might not even get to the second page because they're like reading through it pretty quickly. If you have like 100 people applying for the same role, you can imagine that it's kind of the same process. So I definitely have heard the experience of 1 to 2 pages, but I think from my experience, when I cut it down to 1 page, it helped me get into a lot more roles because I was focusing more on the things that were wow factors, if that makes sense. Does that help?
Yep, definitely. Yeah. Thanks so much. Yep.
Cool. Yeah, so as I was saying, separate into sections. So your name is going to be the biggest heading on the page, but you can still use sections within that and make use of things like bullet points, headings, bold titles to organize your information and make it as easy to read as possible. What else? Cool. Using bullet points. So I said that before. That's one way that you can kind of cut down from using a paragraph full sentence. Just shorten it to bullet points, and we'll go through that a little bit later with some templates as well. Use normal colors. One thing that we notice here is Sometimes people can use resume templates that have a dark mode, or you could have multiple colors, say like you wanted your background to be rainbow colored or something to help you stand out. There's a couple of reasons why you don't want to use too many colors and why you don't want to use a dark mode template. One option, which is kind of a bit old now, but back in my day, there was something called a printer. And if a recruiter tries to print your resume with the bulk of other resumes, yours will probably stand out for the wrong reason because there'll be a black background and it will take ages to print. That's not so much an issue now, but sometimes it can still be an issue in terms of if they decide to print it out, or if you go to something like a careers fair and you try and hand it out to someone, it might cost you a lot more. The other reason is that a lot of companies nowadays use automatic screeners. So sometimes the companies will scan your resume and they'll search for some expected information. And sometimes if you have a fancy or colored resume, it doesn't help you. And instead, perhaps some of that UI kind of design in terms of your resume could be something that you could put elsewhere, such as GitHub or somewhere else. But essentially, automatic screeners sometimes won't be able to read properly if you fill the screen with like black, and then all of a sudden you've got small bits of white text and might not be able to read it. But the main thing to understand here in terms of general tips is to keep your resume consistent. So you want to keep it consistent in terms of the way that you organize your information, in terms of the way that you present that information on the resume, and also in terms of the content of your experience and achievements that you're describing in the resume as well. So here is a really simple example of a resume. There is mine on the left from like about a year ago, and there is one on the right, which has a different template that's just made up and it's available online. So I'm going to be going through mostly mine, but also highlight some of the differences between mine and someone else's. The one on the right is just a template, so none of the information is real. The one on the left kind of has some redacted bits, but it's essentially my resume. So the first section that you'll probably see is we have something like a heading. Obviously, that's just my name. One interesting thing that I did here is you probably see that I've like included an address. I don't necessarily think that that's necessary, but sometimes if you're applying to say overseas roles or something, they're interested in what country you come from. Otherwise, it's probably not expected in terms of remote learning now. So it's not necessarily a requirement for you to be part of that country or to have a working visa or to be a citizen. The rest of the information are things which I think would be key. So obviously the biggest heading on the page is going to be your name. In terms of contact information, you always want to have an email. It's pretty much a requirement, a phone number if you can. And then also you want to put some social, not necessarily social media, but you want to put some access points in terms of additional information on top of your resume. So this for me was outlining my LinkedIn profile, which had some descriptions, I guess, in more detail of what I did in specific positions. Other things that people choose to include there are their GitHub account. So sometimes you have projects that you've made that you could share there as well. And some people, they also make a website or a portfolio. So that's another way of, for example, demonstrating some front-end skills or some UI skills in terms of presenting some of their work there. You'll see in the other one that they've also included things like nationality and date of birth. I think that they kind of just clog up in terms of the amount of information that you have. Nowadays, I don't think it's necessarily a good thing to include your nationality either, because sometimes it can, it can have an effect on the bias based on what nationality you're putting there. And I think that your name should be enough in that section as well. So one thing that some people include is called an objective or some kind of personal statement on their resume. And usually that's about like 1 to 2 sentences describing what type of experience that you're looking for. So this is one that isn't actually in my resume. The first one, which has the question mark next to it. So for example, that one reads, avid full stack software engineer with an interest in front-end development and cybersecurity. I also volunteer in various technology and social projects in my local and global community. So that was a bit of a description of what I was kind of doing, and also what I have an interest in terms of the roles that, for example, different companies were offering. Similar thing with the next one, except it's more specific. You can see here that they've kind of specified what company they're going for. In this example, it was Coursera. In my opinion, the objective statement isn't necessarily as useful, mainly because it uses up a fair amount of space, and they should, for example, a recruiter should be able to understand what your interests are based on the projects and experience that you've outlined below. So this section is essentially optional, in my opinion, because if you're running out of room, this can be a section that you either cut out or keep. It's not required in the resume, so you may or may not include it. Cool. Education. So this is a big one. Education is the section where obviously you want to outline your degree, what you're studying, where, what institution it was, where that's located. You can see here that I've kind of put my University of New South Wales stuff. I also put some tutoring stuff, which might not necessarily be in the education space. But it's kind of linked to my degree. It's linked to subjects that I taught or that I had experience with. And as you can see, I kind of put a description below as well. Some people, they also include their WAM or GPA or something like that. I found that in most cases, you don't need that on your resume. And if a company needs it, or there's some requirement for a specific role that they want a specific grade for, then they'll ask you for it later on in the process if they need it. Sometimes if you have a WAM or a GPA that's really high, for example, it's greater than 80, you can include it if you want to, because it's kind of a wow factor on your resume. And it will also prove your kind of technical expertise that you're able to survive and thrive at uni. You can also include specific subjects or information on specific subjects that you've done well in. For example, this one on the bottom, perhaps it starts outlining all of the courses that they've completed. And if they're relevant to the role, then in a lot of cases, this is something which you can also include as a section or a bullet points underneath that kind of heading for what degree you're studying. Other things that you can include here is if you'd graduated, for example, with some high-class honors, or if you haven't graduated yet, it might be some specific subjects that you did really well in. For example, if you placed, top 20 in a relevant subject, or, if you've done something that's won, a hackathon, something like that might be something that you could put in the education section. One thing to note here, and this is probably the best example of this looks like it's something that is like a high school or some kind of, middle school information in terms of that you've graduated school. I think in a lot of circumstances, once you hit the uni experience, it's not as relevant to add your high school experience into the education section, mainly because your kind of uni experience, the grades that you get, the experience that you have specific to, say, software engineering or computer science, is a lot more relevant to the things that you did in high school as well. So I wouldn't include this section. I didn't in mine. Experience is probably the biggest one. So here we have, all kinds of experience that you've had. In this section, I focused mainly on the internships that I've had, but you can also see that I kind of split experience because it was becoming too big into experience and volunteer experience. So here is one idea of kind of splitting up experience into smaller subsections. This section can include any relevant jobs. Say if you worked at McDonald's as a starting point, if you're in your second or third year, it might be relevant to the role, it may not, but it's something that you can include in order to, demonstrate your skills, perhaps some of your roles at different companies. And this could also include volunteer experience. So you see in this bottom section that I have things, for example, maybe you led some leadership camp, maybe you were involved in a society, whether or not it's CSE-SOC, because it's really important to demonstrate some of those skills that the employers want as well. And this means that you should also focus on some technical skills. So you'll see here that perhaps I've got some more technical information from roles that were specific to a computer science software engineering role, because employers want to know that you have those technical skills, that you have that expertise through university, but they also want to understand who you are as a person, and also some of those additional skills, such as things like organization or communication with other people or leadership, like we mentioned before. A couple of other things. So one important thing is to include your experience in reverse order. So you'll see here that this is the latest experience that I had. So it was something that I had to put at the top of each section. And that was on purpose because, again, if someone's reading your resume from top to bottom, they want to know the most recent things that you've done. Another thing is to avoid using personal pronouns. So you'll see here that, like, in my resume, I haven't used I haven't used me, I haven't used we, because it's mainly about things that I've done, not necessarily about, all about me as a person, all about what I kind of did. Instead, it's still relevant to what I did. It's things that I was involved in, but I'm outlining it as a project rather than outlining it as something that was, 100% mine. I worked alone, and I did all of this by myself, kind of thing. Always start with a verb or some kind of description of what you did. So you see here that, for example, presented, met, improved, led a team are all keywords that kind of start each of these bullet points on purpose in order to describe or demonstrate an action. Another thing that happens inside of here is there's a lot of values, a lot of numbers that are able to quantify what I did in each of those. So you'll see here that, for example, I said improved server response time up to 20 times and reduced backend data processing. So that's something that someone can read and say, wow, this had an impact, which was obviously large because it's improved, it's improved this application by doing this project. What else? Describe the outcome or result. Yeah, so one of the main things that I had here is what was the outcome of that kind of project? What did it end up doing? Some of these were, improving the server response time. Some of them are about the success. For example, facilitated a team of 10 students to create a web application which supports tech companies who advertise internships. So things like that are demonstrating that I'm able to, demonstrate my skills and my strengths, which are relevant to the projects or experience that I've been involved in. Here's the example from the other resume. So again, they also kind of split it up into work experience and volunteering experience. The volunteering experience is kind of more of the motor skills, things that didn't necessarily have technical expertise, but they're important because they demonstrate things that you're doing extracurricularly. So it's not necessarily, C, PHP, JavaScript. It's more so about interaction with other students, how you kind of communicate with them, whether you led some project, whether you were able to organize and communicate all of that. You can also choose to embolden or highlight some of these words, but in neither of these resumes, we decided to do that, but it's something that you could optionally do as well. Cool. Projects. So this is one that I didn't actually have. So this is another one which was scraped off the internet. But projects is another section which can be very similar to experience, but it's demonstrating more hands-on experience that you've gained outside of university or work. So another aspect that you kind of want to demonstrate within your resume is outlining some of the things that you're doing outside of work, because it helps provide employers with an idea of what type of project that you would want to work on in the industry. And also, I guess, more of that objective or personal statement of, I enjoy working on, for example, web applications. So it's perhaps something that I want to work on at said company. Cool. Another section that appears is technical skills. So you'll see in my section that I kind of have a few of the key languages which I understand or learned, and also in the order of their expertise. So you'll see that I'm claiming that I'm an expert of TypeScript, React, HTML, Python, and I have an advanced knowledge of C, Java, or SQL. And I also included another line which was related to operating system and a few other skills that I had, but it's a fairly short section. Or you can decide to go with something that's a bit lengthier, for example, this. But again, I would probably say that this second one, you can imagine, is taking up a lot of space on your resume. And some of these languages, or the fact that Mac OS may or may not be relevant to the role that you're applying for. And it's something that you want to specify in terms of the job description and whether it matches what the employer is looking for. Okay, so that's pretty much all that we have there. One thing that I will mention in addition to those previous things, sometimes if you're going from high school into uni, you'll have things like references. You might also have things like hobbies or awards that you've won. You can also include that, but try to stick to that one-page requirement. These are a few common CV mistakes which we've gone through, as well as a few additional ones. Some big no-nos here. Don't lie about your work experience because it will just catch up with you later on. And also just a bit of formatting for the resume too. That's all I wanted to say in terms of resumes. If we have enough time, I can go through some interview stuff as well. So I guess the first part of interviews is a bit of story time again. So in my penultimate year, I actually applied to about 50 different places, and I heard back from about half of them, so about 25. I then went through the burden of interviewing at all of them and heard back from about 6 or 7 offers, which I thought was pretty good. Some of them, are classified as FANG companies, so things like Facebook or Google, also some finance companies, different parts of different sectors. And the interviewing experience is very similar at some companies, but also wildly different depending on the role that you're applying for, and things like the company culture or how difficult it is to get a position there. I don't recommend applying at 20+ companies because it takes up a lot of your time. But I think that applying and indirectly receiving feedback, for example, to know if your resume is good enough to get an interview, is a good start to getting a job at the end of the day. So I always encourage people to kind of apply to different roles that you're interested in order to gain an understanding of whether your resume or experience is good enough. Also, if you do get the chance to interview at some companies, definitely take up the opportunity as much as you can. Make time for that as part of, for example, your penultimate year. If you're deciding to go for internships, or your final year, if you're deciding to go for grad roles. And that way you'll also be able to make connections and gain some real world experience for interviewing for those professional roles. Okay, so where to look for these roles? Places to apply for these roles, internship or grad roles, would be anywhere. But regarding where to look, the main one is the Grad Connection, which has now become or merged with Seek. They'll give you larger companies. They'll give you larger companies, and they'll give you the application process as well as descriptions for each of those roles. Also see a CSOC. There's roles that are advertised on Discord. There's roles that are advertised on Facebook. They have sponsors, which are obviously present today, and they'll also give you insight into which companies have available roles for you that are relevant to your experience. There's also LinkedIn. So sometimes if you're following a certain company, or you go to the jobs tab within LinkedIn, it can also help build those connections, help find people who, for example, are already working at that company, who might be able to help you in the interview or resume kind of process in order to get you along that job line. And there's also a kind of a bonus one with AngelList. AngelList is more of a US-based thing, but there's similar sites in Australia as well. Essentially what AngelList is it will start pairing you with some smaller startup companies. So say if you're just starting out, you're trying to figure out how you can get your foot in the door, things like this. There's also, for example, advertisements on different Facebook sites related to university. Whether it's paid or unpaid, you'd have to find out from the actual people and the companies themselves. But it's really important to kind of branch out, apply to as many companies as you can, and start getting that feedback loop. 2 main stages of interview process, which I'll go through quickly. The first one is technical. Technical interviews essentially come down to a lot of practice. There's a lot of resources out there, such as LeetCode or HackerRank, things like Algo Expert, and doing those regularly, for example, once a week, once a day, will really help improve your skills in a 30-minute, 1-hour interview scenario. This mainly applies to computer science or software engineering roles. In addition to this, there's also a book called Cracking the Coding Interview, which almost everyone would have seen. I personally didn't necessarily do the exercises or the questions from inside of that, but they're kind of a group of resources which everyone will tell you are really useful. And the more regularly you can do it, the more you can practice, will help you to kind of demonstrate each of those skills in the programming setting. How can you stand out? So one of the big things that comes along in the interview stage is the behavioral interviews. Surprisingly, that section is also very tricky. A lot of times when I came across a behavioral interview, it was things like, whether you match to a company's values and whether or not that, the company actually wants to hire you as part of someone who would be working at that company and within that culture with other people. The typical questions that you get are things like, tell me a time that you failed, but companies usually are trying to analyze whether you're a good fit for the company culture and whether those interviewers or people who you're talking to would actually be able to work with you. Something that I like to do when I search for a company's values is to try and come up with common questions that they might ask, because you always want to tweak your answers slightly. Personal tips. So this is a bit of a summary in terms of interviews. You want to meet as many people as you can, whether that's through uni, getting involved, making yourself known, or talking to any recruiters, for example, today, or for example, at events at uni, remote events, because companies, they want to find out about you. They want to find your passions and help you kind of adjust to working life once you finish uni. The other thing is in terms of the technical interview again. So you really want to focus on your communication skills as well. One of the main factors in terms of a programming interview in particular is that you can answer the question and get it 100% correct. But if you're not working through the solution and talking to the other person on the other side, it's not helpful to them in terms of understanding how you're thinking or how you're actually progressing through that interview if you're just typing out your solution line by line. So another thing is that, for example, if I got a question wrong, which has happened in the past, I might not finish the question, but at least my interviewer can tell that I'm thinking critically, and they can also provide some questions or thoughts that might help me get through the question that they wouldn't otherwise if I was just coding and not saying a word to them. And that was exactly my experience in terms of applying. That's all I had to say for the little presentation or intro to the workshop. So I'll go through any questions that people have in the chat if I can open it. Okay, I think there's a lot of questions to get through. Elaborate on the importance of soft skills. Yeah, so soft skills when interviewing for CS roles. So for example, society involvement, they might not be technical, but if you're able to demonstrate there's core skills like communication or, communication, organization, understanding some of those kind of skills outside of just completing a uni subject or uni work. Those are some of the keys in terms of demonstrating soft skills. I think one of the CSE soft people have been answering along the way as well, but I think that's the last one. Prerequisite uni courses employers look for when hiring. I don't think so. I think a lot of people apply at the end of their first year and they don't necessarily get in. Those subjects are definitely key. So I think the ones that are mentioned are 1531 and 2521. 2521 definitely helps in terms of computer science because it's teaching you the data structures and algorithms which are used in a lot of those problem solving questions. In terms of 1531, that will give you an idea into some of the methods that companies actually use when developing a product or a feature, for example, agile, which are more of the soft skills because they're not necessarily technical to the point of I understand JavaScript, I've been working in it for 5 years, blah, blah, blah. The questions are still coming in. How much time do we have? I can reply to them in the chat while you're setting up breakout rooms. If that's
We've
useful.
already started moving people into breakout rooms just so people don't miss out on their times.
Yeah.
So those who are still asking questions in the chat, it's not currently their time. So feel free to answer questions for as long as you like, Nathan.
I think I've gone over.
Yeah, a little bit, but that's okay. I mean, obviously, it's really interesting for our students to have lots of questions. That's really good engagement. But at the end, I would like to thank our sponsors, even though they're already in breakout rooms.
You can welcome them at the end when they come back.
So yeah, if you want to answer more questions until for a little bit longer, that's completely fine, Nathan.
Yeah. I can answer the side projects. So obviously there's CSC self projects, but a lot of societies will run their own projects. Things that you might have seen are like the Bojangles or like uni subject planners. Another aspect is things like hackathons. So either with a society, for example, CSC Soc, I think SecSoc or a couple of other societies also run hackathons. There's also company run ones, for example, the sponsors who have come here today. So there was like Accenture definitely runs a hackathon. Atlassian, I'm pretty sure runs a hackathon. And I think Citadel runs one maybe, but they're more finance based. So I'm not trading based. So I'm not necessarily sure. Would we recommend that I still apply for jobs even if I haven't completed these courses? I think so. I think worst case is that you get a rejection email telling you that your resume isn't as good enough. It will either be for one or two reasons. It's either you're not in the right year, which is most common, or the other reason is that you just don't have enough experience, in which case it kind of tells you that, for example, over the next year, you should start getting into some of those roles or learning how to actually get yourself more involved in some of those other opportunities outside of just completing uni in order to build up that experience section. Opinion on applying for penultimate internships when you aren't a penultimate student. You can apply for any internship. A lot of cases, they will indicate that they want a penultimate student. I know a lot of instances where people ignore that requirement, which is kind of probably something that I shouldn't mention here, but some companies are stricter than others. So I would say that you can still apply even if it says penultimate. They might send back your resume or whatever, and they might say, you're not the right year, don't apply, or it might even be in the form, they just don't let you apply at all. So that will kind of cut you out. Suggestions on experienced or master's students in terms of, yeah, so I think master's students, you build up more experience sections. So I think the problem with master's students is a lot of times it's kind of tricky to get all of that information down to one page. My experience is that when I had a 2-page resume initially, I was pretty much getting a lot more rejections than I was with a 1-page resume, with the 1-page resume. So that would be a start. I'm just reading the other things. Oh, okay, cool. I won't be here for too long because I have to get back. Any suggestions for experienced master's students? I already did that one, sorry. What if you're a later year student and haven't completed side project or internships? Is that a red flag on resumes? I don't think internships is, but I think, like you said, if you haven't completed an internship, you really want to build some of those hackathon project or side project tasks in order to build up some of that knowledge within your resume. The intention of an internship is to give you skills in a particular project, something that you're working on for 3 months. And that's something that you can also do with like side projects as well. It doesn't have a company name attached to it, but it doesn't mean that it's a red flag on your resume because you're still able to demonstrate that skill. The intention of a resume is simply to get you an interview. So if you're able to demonstrate that you have knowledge of that language or that particular role that you're applying for, then that should be fine. That's my answer for that. Where is the best place to get your foot in the door? I think in a lot of cases you apply everywhere, but in most cases it's only startups or smaller companies that will get back to you at first. unless you have, for example, things like a scholarship or things like, I don't know, you were like a really, really good student, then it's something that, you know, is really hard to do initially. My format, or the way that I kind of got my foot in the door, was by doing that kind of story of applying to X number of companies and getting back the information in terms of like info that you, the info that you're getting back, whether your resume is successful or not. Cool. A startup is a company that is like just beginning to sprout. So say, let's say Facebook back in 2000, if they had like 10 employees and they have basically no revenue, that's what you refer to as a startup. So there's smaller companies that have recently opened, yeah. A lot of cases though, you want to be careful because startups will either have a paid or unpaid internship. So if they're financially stable, it will be paid, but in a lot of cases, it won't be paid. What's your opinion on fancy resumes? Color is fine, but again, you don't want rainbow colored, and generally you don't want a black background in case they print it out mainly. 2-column format is also okay because it's easy to read. Like you can read one column and read the next, but don't go into like columned and then non-columned and then column, because it becomes like a bit of a jigsaw to understand. Hopefully that answers Justin's question. And I think Yuval is trolling.
Right. Thank you so much for your time, Nathan. I'm aware
Good.
that you probably do need to get going.
Yes.
Thanks again for,
No
providing
worries.
your tips and tricks and, some insights and answering questions.
All good. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye, Nathan. In the meantime, I'm going to stop the recording and basically thank our sponsors, even though they're in their breakout rooms right now. We'll have to thank them separately as well. But I hope the students here also enjoy their time talking to Citadel, Accenture, and Atlassian and getting some great feedback. So to those students in the main room, I guess I will be seeing you soon.